Latha Menon.
Okay, should be one just before that. That's better. Okay, so when we think of the Ediacaran biota, probably the images that come to mind are those wonderful assemblages full of frondose forms, Dickinsonias and so forth, mistaken point, Nilpina, etc. However, the reality is that in a number of cases, all we have are discoidal markings like this on a surface. And this is from the Famuse Formation in Newfoundland. Now, in this case, we have several lines of evidence that indicate that these are biological and that they're part of the Ediacaran biota. But it's not always so easy. And frequently, it can be very hard to interpret even biogenicity of discoidal markings. So the work we've been doing the last few years has been on discoidal markings in the Longmyndian Supergroup, Ediacaran, beautiful countryside for picnics. And we have come to the conclusion that the markings here are actually pseudofossils. So I want to focus today on really the roles that microbial mats might play in their formation. So these markings, some of the earliest known from the Ediacaran period, are discovered in the 1850s by John Salter, the great Victorian paleontologist. And they're quite small, a few millimeters in diameter, and positive and negative on these surfaces. And we also find plentiful evidence of microbial textures. In fact, this is the surface of one of Salter's own beautiful specimens now in the BGS collections, and you can see it's covered in microbial filaments. So the work that we've done has been primarily in the rocks of the Ashes Hollow, which is an old quarry, exposes rocks of the upper part of the Bowie Formation. Now, on the left here, you can see what these look like, and that's the reason why we focus on them. Beautiful color contrast between this green mudstone, it's green from chlorite, and this very dark fine sandstone. The dark color comes from hematite, in these submillimetric laminae. So it seems to be very quiet conditions. I'll touch on that white layer later. But age approximately 560 million years at the upper part of the Bowie Formation. Environment thought to be shallow marine, according to work done by Pauly in the 1980s. We actually suspect that it might be rather shallow by the top of the Bowie Formation, but we're working on that. So now these discoidal markings, a number of them on the soles of beds as well as on the tops of beds. Debated for over a century after Salter discovered them as to their biogenicity, but by the end of the 20th century, many researchers believed them to be biological. And in 2005, McIlroy et al. Published a paper in which they gave names to these as forms of fairly familiar Ediacaran discoidal markings, such as Medusinites, Beltonelliformis, and a form that looks like Intritis punctatus verdonkin. These are all known from other Ediacaran assemblages. You'll see that some of these have simple ornamentation in the form of central bosses, and there is even a lobed form that you might see just there with 4 lobes. Looks rather biological. However, after grinding through a large number of these, it became apparent that they all show at their center sandstone structures, which are irregular and spreading and are best explained as very small-scale fluid escape, submillimetric level, in fact. And that, I'm afraid, also includes these ones with simple ornamentation and the lobes as well. Now, the other thing you might notice here, then, are these white, very distinct white layers. And you might just see that they're crinkly. You can also see that they appear to block what would have been the rise of this dark sand slurry in what appears to have been very muddy sediment. So we took a closer look at these, since they seem to be influencing the dynamics. And we actually found that they are silicified microbial mats, beautifully preserved. So we're in the process of characterizing these. They appear to be cyanobacterial sheaths. They're hollow. There are several kinds. And so that is something we're exploring at the moment. But I want to focus on the broader physical impact of having essentially cohesive skins amidst this, this muddy sediment. And here's a curious example where one of these has been torn to pieces, and you can see the bits floating around. You can almost imagine that in the muddy sediment. When you look in thin section, you can really see how these dark, you can see these dark layers, these are tangled microbial filaments, how they tend to constrain and influence the shapes of these very small-scale fluid escape structures, and how they would also influence their expression on the surfaces in the form of the discoidal morphologies. But we think there's another way in which they influence the story here, the dynamics, and that is by mat sealing, by exacerbating the overpressure of sediments deposited above on these fluid-filled sediments below, and actually encouraging some of this very small-scale fluid escape, as I say, submillimetric, some of it. Also helped by gas effusions from the mat activity, which would provide pathways too. So to cut a long story short, all these different architectures that we see on bed soles of these discoidal forms, and some of these rimless, simple markings that we see, negative markings that were called Beltonelliformis on bed tops, can all be explained through a mixture of small-scale fluid escape, rising and being injected through what are often cohesive skins of microbial mat, then rising and spreading, and then sinking to produce load structures, but again with some influence in the shaping from the cohesiveness of the microbial mat. And that, depending on whether it spreads immediately or whether the sand slurry rises a bit and then spreads or is blocked above by another microbial mat layer, influences the shape of the discs that you get. And those simple ornaments, including the lobes, appear to be explained by the rheology of the sediment under these conditions. So what about that final one I mentioned, the form that looks like Intritis punctatus pedonkin? Well, it appears in positive on disc tops, on bed tops, and also positive on bed soles. It's essentially an almost complete raised ring with a central depression. Can also appear in negative counterpart on bed tops. And this is interesting, often so incomplete that it actually appears as pairs of arcs or even as two short parallel ridges. So what's going on here? Well, here's a particularly finely formed example of intrites on a bed top. In cross-section, it turns out that they are torus-shaped. And you find this really interesting and different texture within, fine grain as well. And here's another one which also displays another interesting feature. Many of them show fine layering within the lobes. Here's a wonderful and unusual example where you have layers overarching. Now, so distinctive are these structures in cross-section that you can easily identify them even when there isn't a surface expression right within the polished cross-section. And you may also notice that there is a microbial mat layer running at the base of these forms, and often at the top as well. Some of them are quite elongated. Another feature is that at the center of the torus, we often find these dark sandstone structures which appear to represent fluid escape features from right in the middle of the lobes. Here's a remarkable example in which you can see that the fluid escape appears to have disrupted the top of the upper lobes. It just shows you how muddy these sediments must have been. I think that's quite magical. So what is going on here and how did these structures form? Well, we've just published a proposed model for their formation, which involves fluid injection and also microbial activity. In the classic double-lobed case, as I'll call it, what we think happens is that you have fluid injection from below, which immediately begins to displace these muddy sediments to begin to form these lower lobes, and likewise above to form a simple small sediment volcano. And then it would seem that cyanobacteria tend to congregate on the higher ground here, and trapping and binding, and we think some microbially induced orthogenic clay precipitation going on, possibly some micrite to pick up a slight calcium signal, build up stromatolitic layers, and then the whole structure begins to sink, as everything does in these muddy sediments, to further build these lower layers. Except when you have a thick microbial mat at the bottom, and then you don't tend to get those lower layers. And gas effusions from mat activity alone would be enough to start this process off. It's very small scale, I hasten to add. And now, of course, this remarkable structure is easily explained by further stromatolitic layers building up, overarching, and forming a more typical dome shape. So, in short, what we're saying is this might be described as a new form of MISS, M-I-S-S, a small microstromatolite built up on the flanks of a small sediment volcano. So what makes the cyanobacteria rise to this higher ground? Well, Gerdes et al. Have described this sort of activity in modern mats where cyanobacteria move up, phototaxis primarily, in the process of the building of fairy rings. Now, in this case, there could be some phototaxis going on, but we think also they are attracted to the better access to sediment particles in the current. So that then perhaps explains those strange double arc forms of this entrites-like structure, that you get preferential trapping and binding by the microbes in the parts of the ring that are parallel to the direction of the current. It would also explain why such entrites, double arc entrites forms on a surface all tend to be aligned. And finally, we do find occasionally slightly more extended double ridges like this, as in the white arrow here. And you might expect that once you have a little ridge like this, that the cyanobacteria just adjacent to it would also tend to clamber up and tend to elongate such a ridge. So to summarize, microbial mats can influence fluid dynamics in muddy sediments to produce a range of discoidal structures on bed soles as well as bed tops, through mat sealing and the subsequent shaping of escape and loading features, and through trapping and binding an orthogenic clay precipitation on the flanks of sediment volcanoes to produce microstromatolites, so that you end up with a suite of pseudofossils that may be mistaken for a depauperate Ediacaran biota. Indeed, it was in the Longmynd. And now we've seen examples of discs that look like this in very shallow sediments in Newfoundland, which don't contain the typical familiar Ediacaran fossils. And we have also seen examples in the literature which now, having interpreted these, look remarkably similar, and we suspect that they too may be pseudofossils, except that they have been used to claim the presence of an Ediacaran biota in those rocks. So as we only get discoidal fossils sometimes, it's absolutely crucial that we can tell our pseudofossils from our fossils. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Questions?
What strikes me is what we think is controlling the distribution of
So I suspect, I mean, once we started looking in this way, we found several other results, as I said, from different parts of the world. I don't think people have been searching for it. It's also, one has to be careful, a number of these, like Finmark, I mean, I think they're real, they're biological. These sediments are unique, as you can see, very quiet, very muddy sediments, preserved beautifully. The other exception here is that we have such a fantastic window in these upper Berwick formation. Well, you've just seen what they look like. I haven't coloured them, that's how they look. Amazing preservation. In other examples, which look similar on the surface, we haven't been able to look in cross-section and really see such detail. So both in terms of preservation and window, and the fact that these are in quiet, very muddy conditions, which, you know, relatively unusual, and the fact that we haven't really been looking for such a, as I said, whole range of different morphologies here, so you can understand why people thought they were biological. So I think all of that feeds into your answer, but it's an ongoing story.
Okay. Thank you.